Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about @ID versus @+ID references in our Android project. You see this all the time in our XML files. What's really the difference? Well, today we're going to dive in and see what the differences are. Let's get started. To get started today, I want to start off with a quick example just so you understand what I'm referring to. Here's an example of what I have in a layout file. As you can see, I have cases where I use @ID, @+ID. Well, why choose one over the other? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but at least I want you to understand what I'm referring to. Here is the exact same idea in a navigation graph. I have an inconsistent usage of @ID and @+ID. So let's just dive in and talk about what is @ID. Really, each of these ideas are pretty simple, and the differences are rather subtle. So let me point out what each of these do. @ID is simply used to reference an ID that already exists somewhere else. And we see this idea all the time. So for example, if we want to refer to a string in strings.xml, we'll simply say @string / and then the name of that string. Same thing with drawable, something that already exists inside the drawables folder. It's really no difference here. So obviously, if I'm accessing an existing reference, then that means that reference already needs to exist, right? So the way this works in most files, such as a layout file or navigation file, is they're processed from top to bottom. So if you say I have an element up above that has a certain ID, you can just simply say @ID and refer to that element earlier up in the XML hierarchy because it already exists. The system is aware of it at that point. So that kind of lends us to another question. What if we want to refer to an element that we're going to be creating later? Well, that's where @+ID comes in. So if we go back to the same layout analogy where everything's processed from top to bottom, if I want to refer to an element that's beneath me and lower in the XML hierarchy, I simply say @+ID, refer to that ID, and then later on, once that element is created in the view hierarchy, that ID will exist. So effectively what I'm saying is, whenever I say @+ID, I'm promising that I will be creating this later on and that you'll just know to expect it at some point. So I've just given you 6 different rules for 2 different ways of doing the exact same thing. So you might be wondering, do I really have to keep all of these straight in my head every single time I'm creating a layout file? Well, no. Quite honestly, I follow one rule whenever I put all my layout files together. I always use @+ID. Quite honestly, if you're going to be referring to an ID that doesn't exist somewhere and you promised to create it and you didn't, your layout's going to look wrong. So you'll see in the preview that nothing looks right, and you'll know, you know what, I forgot to create this element. You go ahead and put that element in and say maybe you need to constrain one element to another in a constraint layout. Well, then everything will fall into place because you've created the element that you promised to create. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the anatomy of a reference. And we've talked about effectively all of this stuff on the left side of the slash in this diagram. So simply refers to a reference. So whether it's a string, an ID, or a drawable, this is simply indicating that this is a reference. We talked about the plus. This is an addition operator, and this is the case where we're promising to create or refer to something that will be created later on down in our hierarchy. The ID is the reference type, which again, things like ID, string, drawable, those are the kinds of things that you're going to see there. And everything to the right of that slash is the name of the reference. So in this case, it would be the ID of an element, or the name of a string, or the name of a drawable. That's the effective anatomy of all of these references.